January 17, 1943. Camp 132, Medicine Hat, Alberta. The prairie wind slices across the open flats like a saw blade, rattling the corrugated tin of the watchtowers and combing the snow into ripples that look like the knuckles of a white, clenched fist. In the half-light of a late afternoon sun, a convoy of army trucks groans through the outer gate, tires biting into packed ice. Canvas flaps snap. Diesel fumes mingle with the smell of wet wool and cold iron. Guards in rough khaki greatcoats step forward, rifle slings creaking, while the new arrivals, scores of German prisoners of war, climb down in stiff, tired movements that betray weeks at sea and a continent's worth of train tracks behind them. He is in the second truck, Oberleutnant Karl Heinemann, 29, Luftwaffe observer, his once neat field gray now dulled to the color of old slate. Frost has turned the ends of his hair brittle beneath his cap. The metal rim of his spectacles nips his skin. He pulls his scarf tighter and takes in the scene the way aircrew do, cataloging angles, distances, possibilities, though there is nowhere to fly here and nothing to bomb but the horizon. To his right, Feldwebel Dieter Kostner, square-jawed and sardonic, mutters, "Canada," as if tasting the word to test its temperature. The gate clanks shut. A bell rings somewhere. From the tower, a sentry silhouette turns against the white glare, the dull mouth of a Bren gun pointed at the yard like a reminder to keep one's thoughts obedient. A Canadian officer waits at the sorting station, Captain A. J. Mac McPherson, a lean man in a lined parka with frost rhyming his mustache. He consults a ledger while an orderly hands out numbered tin discs and tags the prisoners' kit bags. "Welcome to Camp 132, McPherson says in a voice that is not unfriendly and not apologetic either. "You'll get hot tea in the mess. Showers after medical checks. Follow instructions and you'll find life here tolerable." He glances up. "Break the rules and you will not." The line shuffles forward, boots squeaking, chain link hissing as the wind rubs it along steel posts. A medic with a Red Cross armband checks fingers for frostbite. A clerk records names painstakingly: Heinemann, Karl. Kostner, Dieter. Vollmer, Otto. The routine has the rhythm of a factory, and by the time Karl has swallowed his first scalding tin mug of tea, his hands have stopped stinging. The mess hut smells of yeast and boiled potatoes, and the heat fogs his spectacles. Someone at the next table is laughing, short, surprised, half-shamed at the sound of it. The laughter makes the guards glance up and then back down again to their cards. "Look," Dieter says, elbowing Karl toward the window. Outside, four Canadian corporals in toques and mitts are dragging a plank-sided sledge across the yard. On it, battered wooden sticks, a handful of black pucks like coal biscuits, and two canvas sacks that clink with metal. The corporals dump the load at the edge of a flat, flooded rectangle where the careful scrape of shovels has revealed glass-clear ice. A prisoner in a greatcoat, older, with a healer's hands, stands transfixed as one corporal holds up a pair of leather boot skates, the blades flashing like a grin. Karl blinks. The sound he hears is not the bark of a guard, not the crack of a bolt sliding home, but the nick-nick of steel across ice. Two Canadians lace up and push off, carving lazy figure eights as if sketching on a clean page. Their breath ghosts in the air. A puck skitters, a stick meets it with a wooden clack that echoes off the huts. Somewhere a raven caws, indignant that such joy has landed inside barbed wire. This is a joke, Dieter decides. To taunt us. But Captain McPherson steps into the doorway, snow ticking off his shoulders. "Hockey," he says, pronouncing it as if the word has weight and purpose. "If you want a closer look, you organize yourselves. We'll be needing a list. Anyone who knows how to skate, or wants to learn." He glances at the corporal with the ledger. "Rinks will be open after work details. We'll keep score, same as any league." "League?" Karl repeats, not sure he has the translation right. "League," McPherson confirms. "Welcome to Canada. It is not how prison is supposed to begin." Carl has rehearsed a different arrival, the sneer, the shove, the ration that insults a man's body, and his mind, tired and weary, cannot close around this new shape. Yet the camp continues to unfold in quiet contradictions. Geneva Convention posters in German and English are thumbtacked beside the mess servery. There is a library, a small one, with dog-eared novels and a pamphlet on learning French. A chaplain crosses the yard in a wool cap, leaving a dotted line of footprints. And now, an outdoor rink, edged by snowbanks and watchful eyes. Dusk thickens. Lamps blink on, sodium halos in the falling flakes. By the time the work details finish, salvage lumber stacked, paths shoveled, stove coal rationed, a knot of prisoners has drifted to the rink edge, drawn by the peculiar gravity of play. A wiry Canadian sergeant with a smashed boxer's nose, Sergeant Webb, drops a spare pair of skates into Carl's hands almost by accident. Sizes are approximate, Webb says, amused. You lads figure it out. He gestures with his chin. Blades stay sharp if you avoid the gravel. Keep them dry. Leather stiff with cold resists Carl's fingers as he works the laces. He feels absurd. He feels watched. The boot toes are cramped, the heel cups are strange. He stands, wobbles, sits again while Dieter snorts and then, unexpectedly, takes a pair for himself. The first step onto the ice is a small surrender. The second is a rediscovery of balance, the way steel wants to move, how weight becomes a sentence you can write and erase in the same motion. A prisoner in a navy pea coat, Otto Vollmer, a machinist from Bremen. Pushes off with cautious strokes, arms out like a counterweight. He grins with all the suddenness of a boy. Rules announce themselves. No checking near the boards. Sticks stay low. Offside is explained, then abandoned, then reinstated with theatrical groans. The puck caroms like fate. The Canadians keep time with a pocket watch and a whistle. When one of the guards, Corporal Singh, glides backward with practiced ease and flicks a pass that lands silk-soft on Carl's stick, the whole yard seems to inhale at once. Carl winds up, strikes, and hears the clean report of wood meeting vulcanized rubber, a sound that is almost musical after months in which everything has been metal and command. He misses the open net by a foot. Raucous laughter, German and Canadian, rides the wind and scatters across snow. The sentry in the tower leans on the rail. McPherson's mouth quirks as if to say that scoring isn't the point yet. The point is how the cold bites and how you bite back, the way sweat stings your eyes even when air freezes in your nostrils, the miracle that your lungs still want more of this sharp, unkind oxygen. The point is that night is less crushing when carved into periods and shifts, when a game clock pretends time can be tamed. Afterward, legs wooden, Carl sits on the rink's edge unlacing skates he didn't know he needed. The prisoners talk with a new tempo, where they learned, who has played, how to flood the ice better tomorrow. Dieter peels off a mitten and rubs a bruise, incredulous and proud. A league, he says, as if naming a foreign bird that somehow landed on his shoulder. In a camp. Carl looks at the blades, the way they reflect lamplight. He thinks of the engines he trusted at altitude, the gyros that spun in darkness, each instrument insisting that balance is possible if you read it right. Behind the mess, a portable pump coughs to life, and Canadian engineers in mufflers begin sluicing new water over the rink, letting it glass over for morning. Somewhere in the huts, someone is already drawing up a schedule on scrap paper, Group A versus Group C, Wednesdays and Saturdays. Points tallied. Goal differentials. A season where winter is both opponent and arena. The barbed wire is still there. The watchtowers remain. War has not relented because men skated under the lights for an hour. But as the prairie wind drops and the stars harden above Camp 132, a different kind of order takes root, one in which humiliation recedes and something like dignity takes the puck at center ice. The prairie night gives way to a dull dawn over the wire. The guards trade shifts, the stove smoke lifts in blue ribbons, and inside the huts, the prisoners begin to talk about what happened the night before. Not about air raids, or missing crews, or Stalingrad, but about slap shots, borrowed skates, and the ridiculous way Sergeant Webb celebrated that single goal like a Stanley Cup champion. By March 1943, what started as an idle Canadian experiment in moral management had become something closer to an institution. In Camp 133, Bowmanville, Ontario, 1,800 miles east of Medicine Hat, the same thing was happening, though the air smelled of pine and frozen lake instead of prairie dust. The Canadians had a theory, drawn from both psychology and pragmatism: a busy prisoner was a peaceful prisoner. And there was nothing that burned energy and settled tempers like hockey. The first official Camp League took shape under the curious eye of Lieutenant Colonel James Walker, Commandant of Bowmanville. Walker, a veteran of the First War, believed discipline could coexist with decency. "Let them skate," he told his officers one morning, pacing before the blackboard. "They'll learn teamwork, not escape routes. They'll burn calories, not bridges. A man can't plot much when his lungs are screaming for air." So, the Canadians cleared the yard of snow and flooded it nightly with water from the nearby creek, forming a rink big enough for 20 men. The prisoners, U-boat sailors, Luftwaffe flyers, and Wehrmacht infantry, volunteered by the dozens. They cobbled together uniforms from dyed bed sheets and stitched armbands bearing the names of teams that sounded half serious, half mocking: the Rhineland Rockets, the Bavarian Blades, Team Atlantic, and one particularly audacious group that called themselves the Luftwaffe Leafs. When Karl Heinemann arrived at Bowmanville as part of a transfer group that spring, the camp already hummed with anticipation. Every Saturday, the rink transformed into something strange and almost sacred. Guards took bets on final scores. Prisoners cheered from behind snowbanks. A German carpenter named Rudi Behrens, who had worked in a Hamburg shipyard, became the unofficial equipment manager, reshaping sticks with a borrowed plane and sharpening skates with an improvised file made from a piece of salvaged saw blade. Each game began with ritual precision. The Canadian referee, a local farmer turned corporal, would drop the puck as the prisoners crouched low, their breath steaming like exhaust. The whistle shrieked, and for 20 frenetic minutes, war became something suspended, frozen in the slap of the puck, the hiss of skates, the groan of boards. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Outside the fence, the world was at war. Cities burned. Ships sank. Inside, enemies shared laughter, bruises, and cups of scalding tea between periods. There were moments when the boundaries blurred altogether, like the afternoon a Canadian goalie borrowed a German skates because his own pair had cracked, or the day two guards joined the match, just to even the sides. Karl was drawn into it almost unwillingly. At first, he played defense, cautious and calculating. But his pilot's instincts, the same spatial precision that once guided him through tracer fire, made him a natural at reading angles and timing rebounds. "You play like you're steering a bomber," Dieter joked one night, "but at least no one dies when you miss your mark." The officers allowed the league to grow. They even printed schedules and posted results on the bulletin board outside the mess hall. Camp rumor had it that Ottawa knew all about the experiment and approved. After all, the Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment, and Canada, distant from the front and rich in space, had room to be generous. "They can't believe it back home," one corporal said over coffee, shaking his head. "We're giving the Nazis hockey sticks." But there was more strategy in it than most guessed. The Canadian War Office had learned from bitter experience that idleness bred defiance. In some European camps, mutinies and escape attempts had flared when prisoners stewed in resentment. Here, a worn-out man with sore legs and a team to cheer for was far less likely to dig tunnels. Hockey became, in its peculiar way, a tool of peacekeeping. That didn't mean tensions vanished. Bowmanville would later erupt into one of the most infamous POW incidents in Canadian history, the Battle of Bowmanville, when prisoners rioted against being shackled, leading to 3 days of chaos and injury. But even in the aftermath, the Hockey League returned, patched together with the same stubbornness that drove men to rebuild cities after bombing raids. If the war ever ends, Karl told Dieter as they laced up one evening, I'll remember this more than anything else, the sound of skates on ice, not bombs on roofs. The guards came to see it, too. They stood quietly along the boards, hands clasped, watching enemy players glide beneath the northern lights. The games blurred into seasons, and by the time the prairie thawed again, newspapers in towns like Medicine Hat and Lethbridge began to publish small, curious stories. German prisoners organize hockey league behind the wire. Photographs showed men in mismatched jerseys, their faces flushed with effort and something deeper, dignity reclaimed through motion. By the winter of 1944, the league had champions. The Bavarian Blades won the Medicine Hat Cup, defeating the Rhineland Rockets 3-2 in a sudden death overtime that drew even the commandant out of his office. A guard's wife baked a cake shaped like a puck. Someone stitched a trophy ribbon from a scrap of Red Cross packaging. The prize meant nothing outside those fences, but inside, it meant the world. In later years, when reporters interviewed former POWs who had lived through those winters, they all mentioned the same small miracle. We could have been treated with hatred, one said, but they gave us skates. Another, now an old man in Hamburg, laughed and recalled, in Canada, even prisoners play hockey. For Karl, the memory would survive everything else, the defeat, the occupation, the rebuilding. Decades later, when his grandson asked what prison was like, he would answer not with tales of cruelty but with a story about a frozen yard, a wooden stick, and a Canadian officer who believed men stayed human when given a game to play. By the time 1944 turned into 1945, snow covered the fences like lace. The war in Europe was nearing its bitter climax, cities burning under Allied bombers, armies grinding through ruined villages, and yet, in the stillness of the Canadian prairie, the barbed wire glittered peacefully under the moonlight. Inside those fences, hockey seasons continued as if untouched by history's roar. Camp 132 at Medicine Hat had grown to house nearly 12,000 German prisoners. It was one of the largest POW facilities in North America, an enclosed world of barracks, mess halls, workshops, and even a theater where men performed Wagner operas and Shakespeare plays. Among these, the rinks stood as the camp's heartbeat, flooded nightly with fire hoses, polished to glass by frost and patience. The commandant, Colonel H.W. Mackenzie, had inherited a policy written not in military manuals but in quiet Canadian pragmatism: treat prisoners firmly, fairly, and humanely. You can't starve hate out of a man, he once told a visitor from Ottawa. But you can exhaust it. His officers watched with interest as the hockey league did exactly that. The prisoners, once defined by uniforms and ranks, were now defined by teams and rivalries. The Bavarian Blades played with graceful precision, relying on fast passing and speed. The Rhineland Rockets preferred brute endurance. And then there were the Prussian Eagles, proud, loud, and constantly arguing with referees. Each team had its own rituals, its own way of lifting spirits in a world where freedom was something glimpsed through frost. To the Canadians, it was more than sport, it was psychology in motion. Hockey, with its rhythm and camaraderie, gave structure to days that might otherwise dissolve into bitterness. It replaced the hierarchy of war with the democracy of play. Officers and enlisted men skated together, sharing benches and sweat, discovering that dignity could survive captivity. One Canadian sergeant named Frank Miller later wrote in his diary, "They came here angry, proud, and certain of their cause. But give a man a stick and a patch of ice, and he forgets ideology. I watched them shout, curse, laugh, then shake hands. You could almost see the hate melt." Karl Heinemann noticed the same transformation among his own countrymen. There was young Fischer, once a die-hard Hitler youth, who now spent his mornings repairing skates instead of preaching politics. There was Schmidt, the former artillery officer, who refereed every Saturday with priest-like impartiality. And there was Dieter, who had stopped making escape maps and started organizing the tournament bracket pinned proudly to the mess wall. Each match had its peculiar theater. Prisoners carved wooden whistles, painted makeshift logos, and even sang anthems before face-offs, half earnest, half absurd tributes to nations they might never see again. On the other side of the rink, Canadian guards leaned on their rifles, smiling in the snow. Yet, beneath the laughter, a deeper current ran. Some prisoners wrestled with guilt. How could they enjoy sport while comrades died abroad? Others found the answer in survival itself. Hockey was our defiance, one former POW later said. They could cage us, but they couldn't take our humanity. Every pass, every shot was proof that we were still men. The game also worked subtle diplomacy. News of Canada's humane treatment of POWs spread through letters and whispers, reaching even the ruins of Germany. It softened post-war animosities before peace was signed. Historians would later call it a quiet victory of character, one that contrasted sharply with the cruelty found in camps across the world. But not all was harmony. Medicine Hat itself would witness two dark episodes, murders committed by Nazi diehards against fellow prisoners accused of betraying Hitler. Those crimes shocked the Canadian public and forced tighter discipline inside the wire. Yet even as gallows were built and courts convened, the rink endured. McPherson, still respected by both guards and prisoners, insisted the games continue. If we end the league, he said, we end the only thing keeping them from turning on each other. That winter, Karl's team faced the Prussian Eagles in the championship. The ice was rough, the crowd of prisoners restless. When Karl took the opening face-off, he glanced up and saw the stars pricking through the night sky. He thought of home, of Bremen's frozen canals, of laughter before the war, of everything that had been taken and might never return. Then the whistle blew, and instinct took over. The match was ferocious. Wood clacked against wood, bodies collided, shouts rang through the cold. When the final buzzer echoed, the score was 2-1. The Bavarian Blades had won again. The crowd, guards and prisoners alike, erupted in cheers. For a fleeting instant, there were no victors or vanquished, only men alive in a world that had forgotten them. Later that night, as Karl sat polishing his skates by the stove, Sergeant Webb passed by and tossed him a folded paper. Inside was a photograph, printed from the camp darkroom. It showed Karl and Dieter mid-stride, chasing the puck, snow flying from their blades. Scrawled underneath in English were 3 words, "Good game, Fritz." Karl smiled. The word, once an insult, felt oddly affectionate now. He kept that photo for the rest of his life. When the war ended months later, and the fences opened for repatriation, many of the men cried. They boarded trains not as soldiers, but as people who had rediscovered something fragile yet indestructible. One guard remembered it best: they came here prisoners. They left hockey players. For decades afterward, reunions were held between former POWs and Canadian guards. Some even played one last friendly game, gray-haired and laughing, on rinks in Edmonton and Bremen. They called it the friendship match. And as for Karl Heinemann, he never forgot that frozen field in Medicine Hat, or the day a Canadian officer handed him a pair of skates and changed the meaning of captivity forever. The last train left Medicine Hat in December 1946. Snow drifted over the tracks as if sealing the chapter closed. But for the men who had lived behind that wire, something essential had already escaped long before their bodies did. It moved invisibly across oceans and decades, a memory that would thaw in unexpected places, in living rooms, in faded albums, and on the gleaming surface of every rink where peace endured. When Karl Heinemann stepped off the ship at Bremerhaven that winter, Germany was barely recognizable. The air stank of rubble dust and burnt coal, entire districts lay flattened. There were no cheering crowds, no banners of victory, only silence, hunger, and the slow rhythm of rebuilding. Yet inside him, there was also something Canada had left behind, a small ember of grace. He went to work as a mechanic, fixing bicycles in the ruins. The habits he had learned in captivity, order, discipline, teamwork, became tools for survival. On Sundays, he played hockey on the frozen ponds outside the city, wearing patched boots and a smile that startled his neighbors. Learned it in prison, he told them once. They laughed, thinking it a joke. But to Carl, it was the truest sentence he ever said. In 1953, a Canadian newspaper ran a story titled "Former German POWs Thank Canada," with a game of hockey. The photograph beneath it showed gray-coated men skating on a lake near Hamburg, using sticks mailed from old guards at Medicine Hat. Some of those guards had written letters over the years, short, friendly, stubbornly human. "If you're ever back this way," one said, "come see the ice again." A few did. In 1963, Carl finally returned. The trip was organized quietly by veterans groups and civic volunteers. Medicine Hat had changed. The camp itself was gone, its fences torn down, the land turned into farmland and housing. Only a small cairn marked the spot. But the locals remembered. An elderly man, the same Sergeant Webb who had once handed Carl his first skates, met him at the train station. "Still got your shot, Fritz?" Webb asked with a grin. That evening, under the orange prairie sunset, they walked to the site where the rink once lay. Someone had flooded a temporary patch of ice in its honor. Old Canadians and former German prisoners laced up their skates together, stiff, laughing, awkward men in borrowed jackets. When the puck dropped, the years dissolved. The sound of steel on ice was the same as it had been in 1943, clean, sharp, and innocent. Spectators cheered, locals, children, and even the mayor. The game didn't matter. The scoreboard stayed blank. At one point, Carl slipped, fell hard, and began to laugh so deeply that others joined in until no one could tell who had started. The wind carried their voices across the prairie, blending into the sigh of winter grass. When darkness came, Webb clapped him on the shoulder. "Guess the Canadians won after all," he joked. Carl shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Humanity did." The story of Canada's POW camps would later become a case study in what historians called the psychology of fairness. Unlike the brutal compounds in Siberia or the Pacific, the Canadian system had found power not in punishment, but in restraint. The camps at Medicine Hat, Bowmanville, and Lethbridge demonstrated that even in the shadow of global hatred, small acts of decency could tilt the moral balance of war. The hockey leagues became symbolic of that lesson. Universities studied them, museums displayed their sticks and photographs. In Ottawa, the Canadian War Museum mounted an exhibit titled "Prisoners on Ice," featuring the battered puck Carl once kept in his pocket, mailed to the curators by his grandson decades later. For the German veterans, those games were something between memory and miracle. They had seen death, cruelty, and annihilation, yet also kindness from the very people who had defeated them. Many credited that experience for reshaping how they viewed the world. One, writing in a 1970s memoir, put it this way: "In war, I learned what hatred can do. In Canada, I learned what mercy can undo. Today, the land where Camp 132 once stood is peaceful again. Wheat fields ripple where barracks stood. Children skate on community rinks, unaware that their laughter echoes ghosts from 80 years ago. But if you listen closely, on certain winter nights, the air still seems to hum faintly with the hiss of blades, the clatter of wooden sticks, and the cry of a puck finding its mark. And somewhere in that sound, between the slap of ice and the soft crunch of snow, lives the memory of men who came as prisoners and left as players. A story of war, told not through blood and iron, but through frozen water and mercy.